Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on Army's doctrine and the vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and today we're going to talk about one of my personal favorites in Army doctrine, the Army's keystone doctrine for all things training. That's right, it's FM 7.0 Day. This is one of those books that impacts every soldier and organization across our force, right up there with books like 3.0 and 5.0 for operations and the operations process, 6.0 on mission command and command and control, and the 622 series focusing on leadership. So when a critical book like this one is revised or updated, it's got ramifications across the Army, which is exactly why we need to discuss 7.0 today. And if you're going to discuss a crucial book like this one, it helps to have a team of heavy hitters come onto the podcast. So I'm lucky enough to sit across the table today from Brigadier General Charles Lombardo, the Commanding General for the Combined Arms Center Training, also known as CAC-T, Colonel Paul Callahan, the Director for Training Management Directorate here with CAC-T, Mr. Bill Brosnan, the Doctrine Branch Chief at Training Management Directorate, and also returning back to the podcast, of course, is Colonel Retired Rich Creed, the Director here at the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nikki. Good to be here.
So before we go diving into the book, I kind of want to set the conditions or set the situation a little bit for our listeners, specifically on what is CAC-T. So I'm going to pitch this over to the CAC-T team. Can you give us kind of a quick overview on the organization itself and a bit about the Training Management Directorate?
Hey, Nikki. Thanks for having the CAC-T team here today. The Combined Arms Center training, we drive change and train and prepare, our Army in order to prevail against the peer enemy in large-scale combat operations. We identify that, and validate the gaps. We manage training support. And really training management to provide a tough and realistic and operational relevant training environment for the Army. But beyond that, I call it's really building a training management capability that is accessible in a persistent training environment. And that's where we're looking to go in the future. We got 6 subordinate organizations. I always tell people from the company training meeting all the way beyond the fire support coordination line, if you kind of think of it in a battlefield framework, these 6 organizations are really the connective tissue for the Army. And it starts with our Army Training Support Center at Fort Eustis. They manage all the training aids, live fire, simulations, the land ranges for the Army. And then, from a lessons learned, it's the Center for Army Lessons Learned, CAL, who's out there in the battlefield today, and they take all those best practices, from our third organization, which is the Combat Training Center Directorate. And they manage and do the kind of the policy, but the resourcing and the standardizations for the combat training centers. JMRC out in Europe, JRTC at Fort Polk, and the National Training Center. And also included in that is the Mission Command Training Program. So from our maneuver DIRT CTCs all the way to our warfighters, the Combat Training Center Directorate manages modernization and just the day-to-day ops, keeping those great training centers, our Army crown jewel, programmed and resourced. Following that is our Mission Commanding Training Program, one of the subsets of the CTCD. In the mid-'80s, it was about, I think, the third CTC built after NTC, JRTC, and that really was designed to give those division and corps commanders a swing at the fight, and they do that in a constructive and virtual. And now, and in the last few years, even in the live domains. And so, great program and great organization there. And they don't stop at just combat training center rotations. Our great MCTP team has done command and control for COVID, Allied Welcome Refuge, so command and control. So they not only coach and teach, but they kind of walk the walk and have stood up kind of standing joint task force headquarters type organizations to assist the Army in those other DISCA type missions. And then the final 2 are the National Sim Center. They truly are the connective tissue. They are the pipes, the simulation, and they also have a global sim capability that is now expanding our warfighter process into home station. So doing a lot to really connect the live virtual constructive domain. Great organization. We just finished an Arctic rotation, and our GSC was able to connect fighting out and training out in the Arctic in Alaska all the way back to Hawaii where a mission command cell was running the constructive simulation feed. So you're starting to really see across the continent how CAC-T can help trainers and training environments get a little more connected. And then last but not least, it's our, why we're here today. It's FM 7.0 and our great Training Management Directorate. But it doesn't stop with doctrine. The TMD, it really is setting up that training passport for the Army. DTMS, on April or here recently, we just published the new Army combat fitness training standards, what it's going to be. So behind the scenes, the TMD team will be building all that into our digital training management systems and being able to populate that and really manage those training assets. So those are the organizations that kind of make up CAC-T and just a short kind of summary of what we've been doing. But yeah, thanks.
Sir, Colonel Callahan, can you tell us a little bit about TMD and what that little organization within such a powerhouse looks like?
Sure. No, thank you. So just kind of adding into what General Lombardo just mentioned. So we write FM 7.0, so the Army's foundational publication for training. We run the Digital Training Management System, DTMS, on behalf of the Army. We also run the Army's training network, so atn.army.mil, which we like for it to be the Army's reference of choice for anything training related. In addition to that, we assist with the Combined Arms Training Strategies, CATS. We also assist with the standardized medal process on behalf of the headquarters for the Army.
So in other words, if we're ever struggling with CATS or ATN or DTMS, it's you guys.
It is. Yes.
Oh, man. But it's still, those are incredibly valuable and incredibly important programs of record that we've been using. And it's nice to know that there is a team that's actually working through these problems that folks can go to and touch back to say, this is the lessons that I'm learning, this is what I'm observing. So I'm really glad that you guys were here today and you were able to take time away from what I know is, it's a busy schedule for your team.
You get a lot of cards and letters from the field on, hey, how come this doesn't work this way? Can't we make this one better? And I mean, that goes back to when you and I were company commanders.
Yeah, so
right?
It's interesting you say that. So we introduced about a year ago the small unit leader tool and the digital job book for DTMS. And actually we have the reverse problem where my predecessor actually had a folder in his inbox for email for why there were problems with DTMS. We have the opposite problem. We have trouble maintaining enhancements to DTMS that the field wants. So what they have through the digital job book and small unit leader tool is really good. And what the force is wanting us to do is add to that. We just don't have the capability to keep up with the demand.
That's cool. So there is another scene setter that we probably have to address in order to really understand why FM 7.0 is such a crucial thing, and that is, what is a training circular? And we have not talked about these publications before on the podcast, but I want to kind of set the conditions and set the understanding overall. So these are crucial to a greater body of knowledge for the Army, and they have a really specific role in relation to their development by the writers and how the force uses them. So I'm going to pitch this one over to Mr. Creed, because I'd like to know who manages these, and how should we, as the audience, think of TCs in relation to this larger body of doctrine out there?
So the vast majority of the training circulars focus on topics that are at echelons below brigade level, right? And so here at the Combined Arms Center, we generally our focus for both doctrine and training is echelons above, outside of CAC-T, echelons above brigade. So we have our own Directorate of Training, for example, within the Mission Command Center, and they collaborate with CAC-T in terms of the training circulars and the training evaluations and outlines and medal development and so forth for echelons above brigade, specifically divisions, corps, and theaters, armies. So where does that leave? The majority of the training circulars are developed by the Directorates of Training and Doctrine. A lot of them are kind of dual-headed. They call them a .D. Some are separate, but they're at the centers of excellence within TRADOC, because that's where the branch and functional area expertise resides, the people with the most current experience from the field, those captains and majors and non-commissioned officers that with recent experience, they bring that to bear to ensure that we're training the way we want to fight. And so, the doctrinal correlation would be if an Army techniques publication, an ATP, those are our most specific types of doctrine, If that provides tactics, techniques, and procedures for how we operate, then the training circulars provide training methodologies and detailed instruction for training on specialized equipment or processes. Things like gunnery, infantry, platoon, or company live fire, situational training exercises at home station, and those kinds of things.
So it's good to know that all these things that we produce, the Army produces a lot of knowledge. So this idea that all of it works together is absolutely crucial, especially now that we've got a handful of CGSOC graduates that are getting ready to head out to the force and become S3s and XOs. This is good things for them to know and good stuff for them to brush up on before they head out.
Well, we've had, and CAC-T gets to see all the same folks that we see, but we're getting flooded with visitors from our allies and partners now that COVID restrictions have lessened a little bit. And the appetite for trying to understand how the U.S. Army does this linkage between doctrine and training, and this process for making sure that training is integrated across branches, functional areas, warfighting functions, and so forth, is something a lot of armies, are struggling to do. And so we've had discussions with the Japanese, with the Israelis, with the Brits, the French, the Koreans, all these folks just within the last month, right? And it always turns back to this, okay, it's great, we're going to have this big conversation about how we want to fight, and then you have to figure out, well, how do you build an army that's going to do that? And what you guys do, sir, I think, is a huge part of that.
I think it goes back to when you helped produce command and control, like really getting back to the science of warfighting. We picked up on that in 2018 when Rich and you and the team published that. Just the getting back from very conceptual mission command to command and control and the science of warfighting. That's kind of the sea change and the cultural shift of taking back some of the training and to reinvigorate decisive action and large-scale combat operations skill sets. Those have atrophied over the past 20 years, and we've been at it about 5-6 years. But it's really our doctrine has driven that culture change, and I think 7.0 is a second example of that, where we kind of look back at let Bill and the team lay that out. But we went back to 1989. How did we get to battle-focused training, the right reps and sets to really re-blue an Army? To take back training. There's not going to be contractors driving it. It's going to be between junior leaders, field grade officers, division commanders in the commander-to-commander dialogue, to the 8-step training model, to building in retraining, to build in really what the Chief of Staff wants to get at is those live reps at the company and below. 7.0 is written exactly for that. It's very small, a lot of how-to examples, whether it's live fire, the conduct of a quarterly training brief, the management of training systems. And so I'd maybe hand it off to you guys if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that and how we've come on our 7.0 journey.
Yes, sir. When we went back to look at why do we want to do this, the last 7.0 was written in 2016, and that was in a coin world. So the Army's starting to transition from what I would describe as a cycle of, pre-deployment. If you look at the Force Com pre-deployment checklist, I mean, that was a monster. So we asked commanders and leaders, focus on that, in order to get units into theater, be prepared for combat operations. So you go through the pre-deployment, the deployment, conduct combat operations, and then redeploy. Those units were in that cycle for a very long time, and what we found the Army's IG did an inspection in 2014, and again in 2019, and our Training Management Directorate has done probably hundreds of mobile training team visits. So combined with the IG inspection reports, moving from a coin environment, and all the anecdotal input that we get from units that, range from division all the way down to squads. That's a lot of information. So, we went back and took a look at that mass of information, and it was about the right time to say, we need to readdress training doctrine to bring it back into the foundational, concepts, principles, and ideas that work so well, with earlier versions of it. And that's really the impetus of why we went down this road, to make it simple, concise, easy to read, easy to understand, and easy to implement. Sir, any comment?
No, I think that was a good summary, Bill. So what I would say, don't be deceived by the size of FM 7.0, because there's a lot packed into it. So what we did is we took a very deliberative process, and if we could say something in a paragraph instead of a page, we used a paragraph, and if we could say it in a sentence instead of a paragraph, we used a sentence. So the core document's only about 25 pages, and then there's 11 detailed appendices that support it. So yeah, it was, again, going back to Bill's comments, the kind of the shift from a coin, modular Army construct back to large-scale combat operations and kind of divisions and senior echelons as the units of action, and that creates a different construct for the doctrine, and everything kind of fell out from there.
You're right, the language in the book is very empowering to company commanders in that company echelon, battery or troop echelon either, that allows them to first grasp the language quickly and then also feel empowered enough to be able to develop training plans, synchronized training plans that get them ready for the next mission or the next training objective that they have. It's a terrific book. I know most people wouldn't say Doctrine is interesting, but this is an interesting one. So,
Well, but so there's an old saying that if I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. You remember back, Bill remembers for sure, but you and I were up at TRADOC headquarters, sir, when the 2016 one came out. And that was all about the Army Chief of Staff saying, we need this thing out, we need it now. And so I remember very clearly when it was delivered, ta-da, up at TRADOC headquarters, so they could bring it up there and show. And one of the things we said is, holy mackerel, that's a big book, right? And it was a good book. There was a lot of really good stuff in it. But it was written, I think, to a level that field grade officers would be comfortable with, and not platoon sergeants and first sergeants and company commanders and platoon leaders. Unlike the book from 1989, which was written for everybody. You felt like when you read it, this was written for me and my organization. So I think that's one of the great accomplishments, and it was a lot of fun iterating that with all the different folks. I'll probably get to that later on and how that went. But it was a lot of work on their behalf to get this thing polished down to something that was like that.
So actually, let's talk about that now. How did your team come together, and how did you? I want to walk through the layout of the book itself, but how and why did your team choose to scope it the way you did? The chapters themselves, and then also the appendices. It's fascinating.
I can talk a little bit to that. One, getting back to Colonel Callahan was saying, you got to deliver this in a way that people clearly understand. I've read a lot of doctrine, I've read a lot of policy over the years, and they're often very difficult to understand. What do you want me to do, or what do you want me to understand? So one of the things that we did was, as Colonel Callahan said, is deliver it in an easy to read, easy to understand, and easy to implement approach. So what was, I think the 2016 version was well over 100 pages, and even earlier versions of 7.0 were up to 300 pages. If you look back at FM 7.1 of 2003, that was a 300-page monster. So as time has gone on, I think we've gotten a little bit smarter about, developing training doctrine. Is units are busy, leaders are busy, so those 5 chapters that make up the core of this manual are only 25 pages. So, definitely easy to at least comprehend and glean the things that you need to understand. Now, the appendices, that was a way to deliver further detail to some of the topics that we talk about in 7.0. So it did that for sure, like annual training guidance. We talk about how to do a task crosswalk, which nobody ever talked about before, but if you go out and talk to soldiers, they know about it. They understand basically what it is, but not how to do it. So we try to include those kinds of topics in this manual. The other thing that we did, relating back to training circulars, from the 1980s up until present day, there were specific topics that were aligned to training management, like how to conduct an after-action review, how to conduct company training meetings, how to do lane training that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. So this was a good opportunity to add some of those topics, in the single place where you want leaders to understand training doctrine. So that was the second piece to the appendices. So in one place, I can understand those 5 chapters of the principles of training and what you want me to understand and think about. But we also deliver a lot of the details that we know work so well and was so well received. I mean, even today, leaders talk to me about what happened to that training circular on how to conduct company training meetings. Well, one of the things we did was polished it up, but that was a really good manual, and even today, leaders still follow it, but now it's part of the field manual, a one-stop shop, if you will, for Army training doctrine. So.
And it's not just that, the book itself has hooks out to the other key documents and doctrine that you need to actually conduct some of these key tasks. So if it doesn't scratch the itch completely, you're going to get a reference out to someplace else, and which is why FM7, it's so elegant in its simplicity, and it really is. It's a great book.
So I didn't think about this when we were first working this a couple 2.5 years ago, but it's become increasingly obvious to us as we work our way through multi-domain operations, and specifically what Army forces have to do in large-scale ground combat operations. As we say, we work as part of a joint and combined arms team. Well, what is a joint and combined arms team? In a LISCO environment, you require a very high level of subject matter expertise. And whatever echelon you're talking about, you have got to be the best in the world at your particular job. And your focus is your particular job, your military occupational specialty, your branch, or your functional area. Otherwise, the combined arms doesn't work if everybody isn't pulling their own weight. And I think the beauty of this very simplistic, applies to everybody, can be understood by everybody, is they can take what the training doctrine says and apply it in their own community. And it's not all about, okay, we're going to, work counterinsurgency, which everybody is pretty much doing the same kind of things all the time, year after year. This is a very different environment. So to drive that cultural change, you needed something authoritative to speak to training in a way that was applicable to everybody across their different areas of expertise.
Well, and I think 7.0 gets us back to mastery. That's what we're trying to get, an Army that has mastery of their tactical task that they have to do. And to me, a big part of it, what spoke to me, is the emphasis on you have to fight to train. Train as you fight, but you have to fight for those opportunities. And I used to have a saying, that every round fired, whether it's live, virtual, or constructive, ought to train as many echelons as possible. And we just don't have the time to do standalone, siloed training events. When the artillery goes out to register their guns, if we don't have observers out there sensing it, if we don't have a mission command set up to command and control it on a JCR, if we don't have echelons, whether it's the company, battalion, and brigade and the fires community in their command post up, it's kind of a shame on us, because that's a golden opportunity. Just from sensing or test firing a weapon system, you could train every formation, inside of a division. And so that's part of the spirit of this. And we used a lot of live fire examples. I come from a heavy combat training center background. So when we started thinking about the live fire annexes, we turned it over to our combat training centers. Those are our masters. They do it every month. They do it for 100 hours a month in a live setting. And so we had them kind of unleash, the training and leader development opportunities to kind of hit that thread that, leader, a lot of leaders, you'll hear them say, hey, I don't have the time to do this leader development because I'm doing this training. And, it's one and the same. Training is the vehicle that you do develop leaders. And so we wanted to illustrate that in a how-to kind of example of how a brigade could take a company team through a CALFEX or through the integrated weapons training strategy doctrine, the Dot 40, and how that would develop, the leader development opportunities that you garnered just from doing that alone. And so I learned a lot of this as a brigade commander. I think we've learned it our whole career, watching my NCOs train me as a young lieutenant, as an apprentice. And, it takes you the 10,000 hours to get to that mastery. But at that point, this is why we got to codify it in doctrine. And, Bill gave us a pretty high mark. The 89 version, I think, it endured for a good 13-something years. That's what we want, we hope out of this current 7.0, that it endures. It's timeless. It's got some very simplistic principles, and that's why we've tried to, I think, lay it out in the manner that we did. So regardless of the Army Force modernization model, this thing will have some good tenure in it, and I think it'll be long lasting. The hard part, and it's a fun problem to have, is we got to get that information out to the force and teach them in consumable chunks how to operationalize this great manual.
It has to become part of the culture.
It does. That is exactly right, Rich. It's got to be a cultural change of taking back training. There are no contractors going to show you how to combine arms. It's you, your platoon sergeant, out in the battle position. You're going to have to dig in the battle position. It's you, your NCOs solving this, guided by doctrine. That's kind of where we're trying to get after it.
I'll pin this rose back on you, sir. So how would you, having this book, if you were to step back into your brigade commander and your brigade commander time period and hat, I'll get to the rest of you gentlemen as well to ask the same question. How would you, or what would you do to start mentoring young leaders as they're using this book and also starting to use some of the new tools that are out there produced by TMD?
That's a great question, and because I try to use this reflective time when I talk to PCC. Here's the scar tissue of what I did not do correctly, and if I had this manual, the first thing I would have done is brought everybody in on like an offsite. Commanders, first sergeants, platoon leaders, platoon sergeants, field grades, and let's underwrite the risk of stuff we're not going to focus on. So let's prioritize training. Let's invest a lot of time and then collectively write a training vision that is accepted by everybody in the organization, that's feasible. I think it starts there. If you put together a good annual training plan based off of your core division and your force, your ARCOM's guidance, that at least starts the training contract. If you do that first, and then you get their buy-in on here's what we're going to be able to do this year or 2 years. Here's where we will focus different things. Because I came in and wanted to, hey, here are our METs. We will do those in every 6-month period, and we'll reevaluate. And I think today, and in this manual, we talk about that. What are we prioritizing that we're not going to be able to do? And then give that feedback to your higher headquarters and let them help underwrite that risk for you. That is really a big part of 7.0, is really getting granular in our commander-to-commander dialogue and really focus on prioritizing training. Not just the 8-step training model of the plan, prepare, execute, and assess, but also the retrain. Because I think we got caught early on in decisive action, in LISCO. Our training programs were so rich that we didn't have time to go back and retrain. And luckily we have a great Force Comm commander. Our chief has even helped us, hey, focus on company live and below, do the retrain, get mastery at that, and before you move to the next echelon, make sure you're proficient at that level. And so that, I think, a good training guidance, a good dialogue that had buy-in, and a plan that allowed for retraining. If I just did those two things, I think you would see increased lethality from being able to shoot, move, communicate.
Colonel Callahan, you're up next.
I agree with General Lombardo's comments. I would, for my foxhole, the prioritization of training. So having commanders and leaders at echelon prioritize what's the most important to train. And then as General Lombardo said, underwrite risk to what's not as important. We wrote an entire chapter on it. It's chapter 2. So in most cases, units do not have the time or resources to train on everything. We just said it out loud, and then we put it in writing in FM 7.0. It's out there. So units that think they can do it all, it's really hard to do that unless you're a very small specialized type unit. I'd also look at the construct of 7.0. So the long-range training training plan is different than the unit training plan in FM 70 from 2016. The whole construct is different. The long-range training plan is based on a fiscal year construct, so you're looking at least into the next FY, and it's a top-down process. So you have the training prioritization from your senior headquarters, and you have the the directive guidance of what they want you to be focused on in terms of prioritized training before you even begin that FY, before you even start developing your training plan. And if you do it on an FY construct, that really the great part of it is it goes into resourcing. Once you get your annual training plan approved at your annual training brief and it becomes your annual training guidance, then you're off to the races. You can actually resource it and execute it as planned, with a few exceptions based on resource constraints. Then I also have units and individuals look at the concept of task mastery. General Lombardo mentioned it earlier, but I think there's still some confusion out there of what task mastery is. I think the best way I've seen it described is you train on a task until you get it right. That's trained, right, based on the standards found in the training evaluation outline. And then for certain very specific tasks that you want to achieve mastery on, you continue to train on those until you can't get it wrong, and that's task mastery. But because it's resource intensive, you really got to be focused on what you want to be good at.
And the conditions change, right? And so the doctrine gets to that. But
Yes.
we used to talk about, in the way old days, about, you're not a T on that topic, until you can do it in Mop 4 in the dark.
Yeah.
Right, and so if you can do it, with your pro mask on and everybody suited up, and you can get your comms to work, all the things that have to happen to be able to do it under the most demanding possible conditions. I would throw a thing out there, and to me it always popped out of this version, much like it did in the old doctrine, which was you have to be a subject matter expert on the topic that you're training other people on. So I had a training support brigade. That was my brigade command, and so we trained Army Reservists and National Guards folks to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you were training people on a particular task, and we would do individual and collective training, right? It's kind of a certification piece. And so a lot of it was directed, as Bill had talked about earlier, right? You got the big long list of things that you had to do, but you got all kinds of units with special capabilities, and they had to be able to do their special things. And what I found was, having somebody stand up there and just read off a list, because that's all they knew. That was like an indicator to me that you guys didn't prepare for this. And so we weren't going to the doctrine to do it. I was coasting off the experiences from the previous doctrine. But that, and the other thing is accurately assessing yourselves, right? Like, sometimes we just assume that we're no good at anything, and we're going to start at the bottom. There's human reasons why we do that. And then there's people that make assumptions that, well, if we did this 6 months ago or a year, we ought to still be okay. And almost always you're wrong on that. And I think the models and the principles in here help you avoid that pitfall, because we've all suffered it, right?
I was going to ask you, sir, about how you would view this book if you were to go back to the ACRC experience and multi-compo training development. That I think it's something that's often lost in doctrine, and this is one of those books where it actually does. It reflects it well, the multi-compo approach and readiness.
Well, yeah, and so if we had this book, one of the things we would have done is, you knew back then pretty far ahead before someone was going to mobilize and come to the training station. So one of the things we would have done when we first reached out to the units and met them for the first time would have brought a stack of 7.0s with us probably, and just gone over the way in which you should address training at home station, because the more you could do at home station, the less pain we have when you show up at the MOB site. So that probably would have been the first one. The other thing is I would have looked at my own team differently and really made fewer assumptions about our level of competence to train certain things. And I would have, if I had to redo, that's what I would have done different.
I think First Army and Division West and Division East all kind of have that same internal struggle all the time when they're looking at, are we prepared to train as OCs, but also are we prepared to guide units towards being ready, because oftentimes our reserve components, Compo 2, Compo 3 with the Guard as well, or I'm sorry, reverse that. Those organizations tend to feel lost, and they're working with such a limited time period to try and get ready for
Well,
them.
you talk about the factor of time, Nikki, and I think that's a huge part of what we were getting after with 7.0 and TMD, and then how that connects to the training management. After we assess the training, how we populate training at the point of performance. And, and that, to me, that all feeds back to unencumbering company commanders and first sergeants, so they're not in the back when I was a lieutenant, there was one computer in the company, and we all took turns using it. But our place in the battlefield was out in the training environment. We were across the cattle guard with our first sergeants and our NCOs, and we were training out there. And so, and I think especially with the digital job book and the small unit leader tool, you can populate those training, those METs, those ACFT weapons at the range. So you're not coming back doing that. You're back doing, you're supervising recovery. So we really, it's about placement of key leaders and keeping them have the access back to their units. And I think that's what the TMD team has given back to the Army. They're giving leaders back to their formations because it's easier. You could be populating in the back of the LMTV on your rifle scores, or when you get done with table 6 on your tank and that AAR, you can populate that score there. In a much easier fashion than the 12 Excel spreadsheets and your NUG and data. And so we're working our way towards that. But I think that's also very helpful. It's the assessment of training and then keeping that assessment so we don't lose it for the next time we train. And that's our next goal as we can holistically codify the results of training. We have access back to it to inform our next cycle of training. And so I wonder if we had to do it all over again, would we have done it differently? I mean, would we were forced to go to the modular army, but could we have just task organized? Because I was General Dempsey's aide at the time, and his whole premise was, hey, if I had the 3rd Cav again, that was his regiment, in 60 to 90 days, I could go back and re-blue those LISCO skills. And I talked to him a couple months ago. I said, sir, as I reflect on that, you couldn't say that today because the atrophy of a generational talent is gone. And so you could go out to the field for 60 to 90 days, but it would take us 60 to 90 just figure out what we're doing. And so, those NCOs in 2004 came in during the Cold War, had reforgers, had fought across Europe, had done the airland battle and all the reps. My gunner, whenever I took my tank platoon, he drew the tank, was a Silver Star winner in Iraq in the invasion. It killed 22 Iraqi T-72s. Was the brigade commander's gunner, but he knew it was 008 in the 2nd Armored Division. It was the 8th tank drawn by 367 Armor, and he mastered that tank. We shot 1,000. He shot the 850. I did my little 150, but he knew everything about that tank. But he had the barometric pressure, gun tube, bore sight data for the 400 times that he did it in his green notebook, and he had green notebooks like the little supply ones duct taped together, binded, and he could tell you, hey sir, in March, based on this temperature, here's where it's going to shoot, and hey, recheck your bore sight. I'm like, how did he know that? Like, I was out there, but
You could do a sequel to the movie Shooter, right?
where do we grow that mastery back in? He had ownership of that tank. That was his tank. You could eat off of it. And then today, when as a brigade commander, I'd go out into the motor pool and I would say, hey, let me see your bore sight data. He's like, oh, sir, it's in digits. It's up here. And this is a platoon sergeant telling me that. I'm like, wrong answer, man. Like, it can't be accessible when you go into the computer. How do you get that kind of tactical WASTA back from because our NCOs will always have to train our officer corps. And that's what I worry about. How do we bake that back into our NCO corps?
But there's so the age of a E7 platoon sergeant dropped. The average age dropped about 7 years.
It did.
In a 2 or 3 year period between about 04 and 07, right?
You're right.
And so
That's the other point.
the NCOs are much younger, which means they don't get as many reps,
Right.
unless you give them opportunities for reps.
Yeah.
So we got talking to two of the high-speed cavalry majors that were guys that write articles. I mean, big brain dudes that were over in the college and over in Sam's. And so they wanted to talk something, so I went over and ate lunch with them. And we got talking. And so there's 3 of these, super geniuses all sitting there.
Yeah.
And they were talking about, like, their experience level. So they all had multiple rotations overseas, doing hard government work. And none of them had done more than 3 gunneries, and 2 of them had only done 2 gunneries. And I said, wow. And so they're going to be future battalion commanders. I did 4 gunneries as an S3.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
I did 4 as a lieutenant before I went to the career course.
so it's,
Like 8.
you just got to have the opportunities to do it. And then some people were saying, well, then you have this other discussion with some other folks who went through the Objective T nightmare,
Yeah.
where every time you broke up a crew, everybody got sent out. And so they'd done all these gunneries, but they never did them with the same people.
Right.
And so it's like, I'm not sure what good lessons I learned or not. Was I just lucky because I didn't even hardly know the people I was with, because they kept doing this thing where you had to keep, that was what I was trying to get to with the certification all the time. It was all about certification, and you were missing the forest for the trees, right? I mean, I need a team. There's a team aspect to training too, right?
Well, and to get to that proficiency, to get to mastery, we got to, and that's why I think we got to go back. You remember, we were at Trade Aquin, I think Joe March and him came and we talked about, but like when we lost the MTPs, we're getting a little bit back to it with CATs, but to me the next level would be to really put the rigor back in and get that. Hey, you can do 90% of the task, but if you still can't breach and assault the enemy, then you still haven't won. Even though, hey, I've done 9 out of 10 METs, I'm green. You know, like it's got to be outcomes based. You know.
So I've long said, you know what a really good battalion is? A battalion that does really well at a combat training center is a battalion where the companies and platoons can execute their drills. Yeah. So the different forms of attack and everything, at that level, when you're talking FM, you're talking drills. And to be able to execute drills, contact right, contact left, go to wedge, go to this, executing the defile drill, all of those things, the speed of execution matters, and to be fast at doing that requires a whole lot of reps, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of things that are unspoken that don't have to be said when I direct you on those things. And so you can't do the division thing. I can't even uncoil a division from a tactical assembler, and I've only done that once, right? And I was in Germany doing it. But all the little things, the outcome is an aggregate. Yeah. So the aggregate of the division, the higher the echelon, the number of things in the aggregate that have to happen on time and to standard is huge.
We're getting there. It's just we got to be able to work through the interfaces and interdependencies of, you drive your tank, you finish dispatching it, the miles and hours that you have just driven that tank will automatically speak to another Army system, whether it's GCCS Army or and then those hours and miles accumulate to a driver's badge that talks to IPSA. We're looking at AI, machine learned kind of intuitive data management to inform all the personnel transactions, yet another kind of tax on leaders, to do all that stuff. And that's all part of training. It's not just the execution of training, it's the stuff you do afterwards, the assessment, the after action reviews, recovery, and then the preparation to get back into it. And so I think 7.0 lays out a template of how to, and then the rest of the TMD's work and portfolio really gives the kind of the connective tissue to be able to work that stuff in there. So I don't know.
Mr. Brosnan, how about you? What are you telling them young captains?
Well, I think we, I give, sometimes classes and lectures, and I get to talk to junior leaders. And the one thing that I think FM 7.0 has done, it puts the ownership of training in the hands of commanders, but that also includes platoon leaders, squad leaders, crew and team leaders, because we hear comments all the time, from company commanders and platoon leaders, I'm going to wait for brigade or battalion to tell me what to do. So there's still that culture of, come train me, because I don't know how to do this business. So it's obviously getting better, but we still get comments from junior leaders that, when it comes to training and training doctrine, there's this expectation that somebody's going to come and train my unit for me. And I think what 7.0 is pushing leaders to do is you own it. You're responsible. Commanders are responsible. Platoon leaders are responsible. Squad leaders and all the way down. And if I was going to advise, a junior leader on anything is, take this book, understand what's in it, but you're the owner of training your unit and bringing your unit to some degree of proficiency. Because right now I think we're getting there, but it's a slow burn, I suppose.
Well, and when you're used to other people providing it, you get a very skewed attitude about training, I think. And I could be wrong about this, but I don't think I am. It's okay, I'm waiting for someone to provide me this product and I'm just going to fall in on it. And therefore I'm waiting. And the principles that you have in 7.0, both at the ADP and FM7, both pubs, really should be trying to change an attitude, which is I should be looking for every possible opportunity to train. And as a platoon leader, if you go back far enough, the expectation was, hey, I'm providing my training plan to the company commander on how we're going to get after this. We got gunnery going up. We're going to do chair drills. We're going to do TCGST.
Now it's GST, yeah.
All of those kinds of things. And you can do those in a room. You can do them sitting out on the ground out in the company area. You don't need special equipment to do that. You can do tabletop exercises. You can do whiteboard things. There's all kinds of things you can do. And it was always alarming to me that was not a norm everywhere.
Well, you look at in the MRX in the COIN environment, we went out to the field as a brigade, at the battalion as a minimum.
Yeah.
And I remember this as a 3 and XO at Fort Hood. And as a young tank platoon leader, though, in the early 90s, I deployed my platoon to the field by myself at times, and the platoon sergeant worked with the company first sergeant, and we would just go out and train. Right. It was just training. Not everything was an eval. We were training to get better, and we used our mission training plan standards. But right. I think that's part of the culture of it's okay for you to take your platoon out, at the platoon leader, platoon sergeant level, go out, deploy yourself. Because what you learn when you're by yourself, you forget something. It's a lot more painful than to ask the company. And you can take that up at echelon, really training and giving that same independence that I gave the platoon in the southern border of the Afghanistan, that was out there on a cop by themselves. We've got to really take those lessons learned and continue. The last 20 years taught us a lot about independent, decentralized operations. We got to apply that in a LISCO environment to enable and empower these junior leaders that they've got the capability to do that. We just got to trust them.
Well, and it's not all linked to a certification. Right. So folks are like, well, I'm going to do this event so that I can say that I've got these things checked off, and I'm, the old Objective T idea. We're going to do this window, and we're going to hit these gates, and training's not all about hitting gates. Mm-hmm. Right. Training's about reps and experience and being, like you said, on your own and figuring things out and assuming that responsibility. Because, like you said, when we go deploy, all of a sudden everybody gets thrown in the deep end of the pool, and we're going to become band of brothers and sisters and self-actualized when we actually haven't done that on our own. When did you get the chance to do that?
Well, and to facilitate the ability to get sets and reps, we created the concept called battle task, which is we have mission essential tasks down to company level, but then we created the battle task at below company level. And what that really is intended to do is to empower platoon leaders and squad leaders and non-commissioned officers in charge of teams, squads, and crews to identify at their echelon those tasks that are the most important for doing the mission at their level. And then they recommend those tasks up to at least the company commander if they're battle tasks to ensure nesting, but those non-commissioned officers and platoon leaders are responsible for training at their echelon. And then, as you said, to get to the sets and reps, it's focused. So we're not doing everything. We're focused on these specific battle tasks, and we're going to do them until we hit the proficiency level designated, or on certain ones we achieve mastery.
So all of this, the idea of empowering company grade leaders all the way down to the squad level, and then also sort of underwriting that risk and owning it, begins with understanding principles and kind of going towards that direction a little bit. I do want to dive deeper into how you came up with the principles you did, because the ones that are in ADP 7.0 right now, it's only 4 of them. And then all of a sudden FM 7.0 comes out with these 7 principles that really are like, whose were these and where did they come from? Because they're awesome. I like them. I'm cool with them.
So what we did when we started this process, this was summer back of 2019, and we probably need to just take a quick step back. So one of the challenges that I at least saw with the 2016 version of FM 7.0 is that it was overly complex. So it talked about training management through the operations process, so plan, prepare, execute, assess. It also talked about it through the military decision-making process. And then as if that wasn't enough, we also talked about it through the mission command philosophy. So that's an awful lot to try to get after training management. So we wanted to simplify it as much as we could. And as we were doing that, we just kind of went back to the basics. We went back and did our homework and started with the 1988 version of FM 25-100. And we just started kind of looking back at some of the manuals, the field manuals that had a really good reputation, 25-100 probably being the best, just kind of as the gold standard. And we kind of went back and looked at it as, okay, well, why is it the gold standard, and what's in it that maybe we need to bring back or pull back forward. So we went through all of the FMs and the ADP.
Yeah, I think the big one I really appreciated. We added fight to train, but also sustain levels of training proficiency over time. And what we learned a lot in the R4 Gen model, where we would purposely bring a unit together at MRX minus 45. You'd go to the combat training center with your people, and then you'd deploy. You'd come back, and then you broke it completely apart. And so I like that we've reintroduced, hey, you've got to maintain in that band, and to sustain your level of training, but also train at a level that is sustainable. You can't, and you think about people's first environment, like you can't break yourselves before you get to the combat training center rotation to only know that you have a rotation, maybe a deployed, you enter that deployable module. So it's got to have some balance to it. And that's where I think Paul and Bill's team, they really get into the nuts and bolts of how to architect a training calendar so it is sustainable over time. You got to pay your taxes and investment and services. That's a training event. And you've got to look at the training management and the battle roster management, the training, the management of people, whether it's a sustainable readiness model or the rearm model that we have today. Leaders are going to come and go in small percentages, but it's really about how the commander and first sergeant use the art and science of retaining proficiency in those crews. We're going to give people back to TRADOC, those broadening assignments, because the enterprise and institutional army needs that in order to train the next round. And so I think that whole training at a level that you can sustain, not only from a maintenance perspective, so you don't run off that maintenance cliff, if you will. If you're an armored unit, we all know what that means. You got to have time to reset your people, the equipment, and your systems and your families. But it's more about just maintaining a sustainable tempo of training. So it's predictable. People ask me, hey, how do you reconcile this with the People's First Initiative? I go, it fits right into it. We want, a predictable training calendar that is engaged with engaged leaders is probably 90% of the issues and some of the things and the problems that you'll have in a unit, on flow of communication and expectation management. We think that's all really about the principles in 7.0, commanders driving training, non-commissioned officers leading the individual certification and training, and then populating and publicly communicating your guidance and training and informing your lower and your subordinate headquarters. Here's how you fit into the plan, and here's your trade space. And I think that's all part of it.
I used to make me crazy when we used to talk about the CTC rotation. Get ready to go to NTC. That's the Super Bowl, right? So wrong sport,
Right.
Readiness in the Army is more akin to a baseball season.
Yeah.
We got 162 games, and when I get to that capstone training event, it's not one event. There's 5 or 6 or 7 events there, right? And I want to win them all. But if I can win, if I go 4-3, I win the World Series, right? But all those things that you have to do over the course of a very long training, you've got all kinds of people coming and going off of your team. You've got to do a lot of routine things routinely, whether it's batting practice or the way you warm up and stretch, all of those things. And you don't want to take the metaphor too far, but it's a different mentality that involves a much longer amount of time. And you can't burn, like General Parks used to say, you can't burn up all your organizational energy at 100% all the time. I mean, you got to be able to operate at a certain level because you're going to be asked to do all other kinds of things too.
That's exactly right.
So one of the questions that I got hit with on social media, oddly enough over Twitter, was discussing this specific area. It was the P-week model and how that worked against, or what was variations from R4Gen. And more importantly, I think that what really came out of it was there was a lot of us, myself included, that grew up from that company and troop and battery position in our lives with R4Gen and red, amber, green cycles.
Right.
And that just, it became this giant horse blanket around us that kept us from actually having a chance to get into permissive training environments that let us be company commanders for a change. How does P-week model balance that idea of being prescriptive but being permissive at the same time and still allowing a commander to protect their companies and do training?
Yeah, so the P-week methodology is a time management system. So it's not prescriptive. You can use green, amber, red. We've talked to some law enforcement units that use a green, amber, red, blue cycle, where blue is kind of the law enforcement time that they're spending on the roads keeping us safe. Some units, just based on their size and number of units available, are on a red or green cycle. So from a doctrinal perspective, it's not as important to us which time management system is being used, but that one is being used. And really, it's not for managing taskings. I think some people get confused with, hey, how do I manage taskings through it? The intent of it is to protect the collective training time in order to ensure that as many units are getting out to execute with all of their personnel, as many of those key higher echelon, whether that's squad, platoon, company, whatever, collective training events with all of their personnel. And then the units that are not in that cycle, because you have a time management system in place, are doing it on the red cycle, still executing training as they can, but that way it's being managed. The other part I'd like to highlight on that is it's a great methodology, but it's a, in my opinion, it's a how to do stuff, not necessarily a what to do. So you still need to have a prioritized training, a task prioritization within that. So train on this during this time period. Well, train on what? Train on attack, train on defend. That's your prioritization. I'm going to underwrite risk and that stuff. And then I think you're off to the races. So it's a great methodology. It actually came from one of the corps. It's being adopted in several units across the Army. We're fully in support of it. But just remember that as you're instituting it, don't forget to prioritize that training and inform your unit and the units underneath you what you want to focus on.
And that comes out of a battalion and squadron commander, right? Okay.
Yeah, and that brigade commander, as he or she's working with the division, I like it because it is a tailorable, and it does empower at the subordinate level, but it's tailorable. I mean, an example, the 4th Division has a heavy striker formation in it. General Hodney today could use that P-week model to provide focus, but then allow the decentralized kind of methodology, allow those BCTs to prioritize as a part of, as we talk about commander-to-commander dialogue back in the 7.0, how they would tackle that. So there's not a discrete, hey, here is the cross, or here is the very road-gated training strategy. They could maybe get after services up front, and then they'll work, the recovery from that, then they'll work into individual, or they can do the integrated weapons training strategy down the line. I do like the green, amber, red. I grew up on it, but I think there's opportunities in that. And I had a really good brigade commander as a battalion commander, squadron commander. He viewed the red cycle. He's like, it's an opportunity. It's a place where you can focus, and that's your reserve force, And he would always say, hey, if you're in red, you're doing a lot of great individual training, but you're also the reserve for the installation, the brigade, the division, and you can practice those kind of things. Be prepared to. And granted, you are going to get consumed with a lot of red cycle taskings, but while you're doing that, you could really train junior leaders to go to the range one day and the be prepared aspect of it. It really lent itself, at least when we went in our counterinsurgency fight down to southern Afghanistan. Those platoon leaders that were in red, he turned everything into a training event. There was no taskings; those were just training opportunities. And I think that's all in the command approach. he had put our squadron on as the unit that ran the training for the Warrior Forge. It was all the cadet summer training. But instead of it being a tasking, he turned it into a full-up kind of counterinsurgency fight. We had an AO, and our tasking was to provide route security for cadets' buses to get from point A to point B. And instead of a live fire demonstration, he turned it into 16 CALFEXs. So in the summer where I thought, oh, I'm red all summer, it's going to be horrible, I got an entire 120 days of training, 80 of it in the field. Our troop commanders were able to do independent training. But that's just one example of a brigade turning, and it turned that into, it's not a tax, it's an investment into training. So it's really the way, not just spending it, but the way you manage it, and the way you fence it. And that's, again, training management things that he did without any core. We didn't even have a division. It was at JBLM at the time. There was no training guidance. He took that, developed a plan, and gave us the opportunity and the power. Here's the blank canvas. Go support Cadet Command. That was basically the guidance I got, and so I appreciate that. And that's the kind of leader development that we aspire to get from 7.0 today.
Well, and it comes back to, Mr. Creed, what you said before about this idea of there's a change in tone, and a unit will take on the tone of its commander. If a commander is completely invested in this idea that everything is a training opportunity, it just needs to be resourced, and the risk needs to be mitigated.
Right.
So one of the other differences in this latest version of 7.0 is the instructions for developing the crosswalk. Make sure that it's nested with a medal all the way down to those individual supporting tasks, the battle tasks. Was this less prominent in 2016's 7.0? I guess. But it seems like it promoted this real reliance on all the systems, ATN, the CATs, the Combined Arms Training strategies. It's just, to develop a unit plan, it required some training and education. How, and this was also something that my peers and I have been discussing on Twitter, how is this change now giving power back to leaders, and how are we balancing all of these digital and online tools? It seems it's a lot.
Well, I think previous doctrine never really walked the dog down to the individual soldier level. Everything stopped at company level with METs. I mean, if you look at training doctrine, that was the focus. That's what we did. In fact, we didn't talk about weapons, and we didn't talk about collective live fire either. So when you stop and think about, well, what makes a unit proficient? Well, it's those three things. It's mission essential tasks, it's collective live fire, and it's weapons qualification. And all of those things, in a composite, make a trained and ready unit, if you will. Now, getting back to that idea of mission essential tasks, prioritizing those, because you only have, a certain amount of time to train, a certain amount of resources. So you really have to understand that you train the most important things that the unit needs to be proficient in order for mission success. Below that, platoons, squads, crews, and teams, well, that idea doesn't just stop at the company level. It has got to go down all the way down to the individual task. And what I ask leaders to do is, when you start looking at the number of tasks we ask our soldiers to be able to perform, it's a huge number. I think about 2 years ago, I'd looked at MOS 19 Delta, just to walk the dog on it. And I went to the soldiers' manuals and I started to crunch the numbers. And just looking at critical tasks, MOS-related tasks, and you have Army warrior tasks and battle drills, that number was over 260 tasks, measurable tasks that we ask our soldiers to be proficient in. So, or the company commander, is prioritizing his METs, to meet mission requirements. Well, it becomes very important at the platoon, squad, all the way down to the individual soldier level, that those leaders take the same concept of prioritizing, because there's not enough time and there's not enough resources. And so that foundation, if you don't tailor that foundation right, you'll just throw up your hands because there are too many tasks that you could train. It just all goes back to the mission. The mission drives what we train. So, I think we never really got down into that level of detail with previous doctrine.
Yeah, I would just add that, so if you look at doctrine, that's the process. That's what you should do. ATN and CATs are the tools to assist one in doing it. And what we're doing, if you were to ask me, what we're doing next in the doctrine realm is we're creating a tool called a long-range planning tool that pulls the data that's in the Combined Arms training strategies and makes it really easy to use. It's almost like instead of teaching someone long division, we're going to hand them a calculator. So it'll identify the mission essential task if it's a company or above. It'll help identify the battle task if it's platoon or below. It'll link the proponent recommended training events to best train that training event or that task. It'll also give you the resources that are recommended to support it, whether it's land, ammunition, whatever, how much time approximately takes to train that, and it'll give you a link to a calendar that's linked into DTMS to track it. And if your company commander uses that also, it'll auto-generate a training schedule for you. So we're looking to release that here in the not too distant future, in the next quarter or two. But yeah, that should be a huge step forward. And then we're also working on a handbook to kind of further flush out some of the how-to processes at platoon and below to talk leaders at that echelon, squads and down about some best TTPs on how to do that. And we're looking at publishing that probably in the April-May timeframe through ATN.
Awesome. We're going to keep an eye out for that one.
I think in the realm of training, understanding the doctrine is your first step. But you can't do the doctrine unless you use these tools, that we spent a lot of effort and time and money in. You can't, without these tools, you can't get to your headquarters DA standard medal. You can't get to training and evaluation outlines. You can't get to the videos and the tutorials that go into a lot of detail. So in the training world, it's the doctrine first, but you have to have a good understanding of what all of these tools, whether it's ATN, DTMS, or CATS, what they deliver and how they help you do this job of training your unit.
What are some of the other tools and books and things out there that you would advise, first of all, our graduates out of PCC, the pre-command course, and also some of our young leaders that are getting ready to step back into the course out of Fort Leavenworth and CGSOC? What would you tell them to put in their kit bags today?
Well, some of the stuff just at CAC-T, and we're probably getting ready to move it over, is how the Army fights. Our Center for Army's Lessons Learned just developed, great Army civilian, Joyce Burnett, just developed for brigades, divisions, and corps, just incredible website that you can get to with a username password, but it links doctrine, it links the entire scenario of how we fight. It's got inner links to, if I was a 3, I would go onto that site. It would be my favorite. You could go to every combat training center as far as AAR teach tools. It's got best practices into the centers of excellence. Between that and ATN, if you had just those two sites, and we're getting ready to, I'm going to give the people back to TMD to manage it, but at some point I would love that on ATN, so there's just one site that they go to. Between those two, you really have everything you need to manage training, to provide classes on the doctrinal teach, and then some best practices on, to assess training, So that's my very biased view of it. Bill, Paul, what do you think? And Rich has got some good stuff too from the Project Athena, and then there's other things inside the CAC kind of silos. That's another one I would have them plug into my favorites. The whole continuum of learning.
So I would just make the pitch for FM 7.0. Again, the base document is 25 pages-ish, and then I'd recommend at least these 4 appendices. So Appendix A, Commander's Training Guidance. Appendix B, the Task Crosswalk. Appendix E, Training Meetings. Rich was talking about training circulars earlier. So Appendix E is the old Training Circular 25-30 company training meeting. We codified it in Doctrine, so it's right there in the FM now. And then the last one, if you're going to a tactical unit, would be Appendix I, which is the live fire training. So we wrote most of the FM in-house. With General Lombardo's assistance, though, we did reach out to the combat training centers for assistance with the live fire training. So most of that's coming straight from the OCs that deal with brigade and below level live fires on a rotational basis. So a lot of that great work came from them.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for coming out and talking today. At the same time of all of this amazing doctrine that's being now put out throughout Fort Leavenworth, I have to say that if train until you can't get it wrong is something that you really want to invest in further, you can't go wrong with finding a copy of FM 7.0 on the APD website. It's also right there with all the other doctrine and the training circulars that will help support your training objectives overall. We also want to thank our listeners for joining us today. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by the always doctrinally correct Captain Wyatt Harper. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button on either Apple or Google Podcasts and get new episodes automatically. And you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook for updates on the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, on our new episodes, Doctrine Digest video shorts, audio books, and most importantly, some new doctrine. You can continue to follow the team at the Combined Arms Center Training at USA CAC Training on Twitter for updates on their training publications, tools, that new handbook that's coming out. And also, you can use their Victory Through Training hashtag to be able to tag them into content and posts that you have as you're training your organizations across the United States Army and further. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Dean, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.